Across the globe, the drums of war are beating. From spiralling conflicts in Ukraine and across the Middle East, to the ratcheting up of tensions across the South China Sea, and insurgencies in Africa and Myanmar. The potential for an all-encompassing global conflict is closer now than it's been for decades. The business of fighting wars is booming.
Beijing is increasing military spending, claiming efforts to contain China are escalating.
The Biden administration is releasing its first federal budget proposal as well. It includes $753 billion in defense spending.
In 2023, global military spending hit record heights, with an eye-watering US $2.4 trillion spent on defence. But despite the cash splash, military enlistment numbers across the world are dwindling. So why is this happening? And what does it say about how the wars of the future will be fought and won? I'm Emma Hoy, and this is Leave It to the Experts. Let's start with the obvious question. Why are young people today so uninterested in signing up to the military? Well, according to Vincenzo Bove, a professor of political science at Warwick University in the UK, it boils down to three things. 1, they're overwhelmingly against war. 2, they're less patriotic than previous generations. And 3, and perhaps most tellingly, don't see the military as an attractive career path.
Most of us, our reaction to the wars that are going on, and we don't want to be a part of that. We all want to protest.
As a result, recruitment in the US dropped nearly 60% between 1980 and 2020, while nations across Europe, including England and Germany, are also struggling to find recruits. However, having the largest standing military is no longer as decisive in battle as it once was. Technology has drastically changed the way we fight, meaning victory can also be achieved by having the smartest and most advanced fighting force.
Meet Ukraine's new drone warriors. Ukraine trained 10,000 drone pilots. Another 10,000 are being trained right now.
There are countless examples across history. However, most recently, the ability for Ukrainian forces to push Russia's invasion not only away from the outskirts of the capital Kyiv, but almost back to the Russian border, was not done through numbers, but by sophisticated technologies and support from its allies.
Kyiv says it's countering Russia's numerical advantage by being nimble, quick and accurate. And it's made possible, they say, by artificial intelligence.
Across the globe, enormous amounts of cash spent on defence has been poured into automation, artificial intelligence, big data, and drone warfare, as military forces all over the world prepare for the battlefields of tomorrow.
So in the world of AI, so you got massive amount of sensors out there which are generating a massive amount of information. What AI will do, absorb that information, correlate it, and turn it into useful intelligence or action.
This means that resources are used more efficiently and effectively, allowing targets to be located, threats assessed, and plans executed in warp speed. And as the wars in Ukraine and Gaza rage on, strategists are being provided real-time insight into the prevailing weapons and technologies and how they're best deployed.
45 drones attacked different regions of Russia overnight.
The future of warfare is rapidly changing. Retired US General Mark Milley, who served as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff until 2023, predicts that up to a third of the US military could be robotic forces controlled by AI systems by the end of next decade.
You're going to see large components of those militaries become robotic. It won't be 100%. You're still going to have pilots and sailors and soldiers, but you're going to see an increasing use of robots and robotic forces.
Let that sink in. Robots fighting wars that humans can control remotely. While it may seem somewhat like the Terminator movies, it's not all that different to how much of our wars are currently being fought. The use of drones during the war in Ukraine has reached unprecedented levels, with estimates that Ukrainian forces are using and losing an incredible 10,000 of them a month, while the Houthi group from Yemen has used drones rigged with explosive, reaching all the way to Israel.
Israel says it is investigating how its defenses failed to prevent a drone strike in central Tel Aviv. Houthi rebels in Yemen claimed responsibility for the attack, which killed...
This trend points towards a long-predicted future of robotic warfare. But we're not there quite yet. While the war in Ukraine is being fought with next-generation technology, It's also a hybrid of the new and the old. Trench warfare, last seen at a global scale in the First World War over a century ago, now splits the front line between Ukrainian and Russian forces.
So until the war in Ukraine, I genuinely thought that trench warfare really was a thing of the past, but the footage that has come out of Ukraine over the last couple of years has really shown how those skills are essential.
Nations are wargaming any and every conceivable situation in an attempt not to fall behind in a rapidly changing world. Take Australia, for example. After assessing the nation's defences last year, former Australian Defence Force chiefs Angus Houston and former Defence Minister Stephen Smith said the nation simply wasn't prepared for the dawning of what they called the missile age, damning a defence strategy based on low-level terrorist threats and distant conflicts in the Middle East.
We are about to make an immediate and major investment in guided weapons and missiles, according to the review, things we can shoot at people from a long way away.
They pointed to what they see as the growing threat much closer to home: China. The report states that China is amassing the greatest military build-up of any nation since the end of the Second World War. And while Australia has used geographic isolation as its greatest defensive tool to date, that will mean next to nothing when missiles can strike with extreme precision from launch pads thousands of kilometres away. So what does this mean for a nation like Australia? Isolated from its major military ally, the United States, is it ready to fight the wars of the future? To see what those battles might look like, my colleague Sam Hendricks sat down with Adjunct Professor Albert Palazzo at the University of New South Wales. Here's what he had to say.
I wanted to start with the DSR, the Defense Strategic Review, that was delivered like a year and a half ago. And there was pretty loud public reaction at the time. And you wrote a long analysis of that, suggesting that reaction was a bit overdramatic. But you did also say that the Army will need to modify its doctrine, its training, and even the type of individual favored by recruiters, and also establish programs for the acquisition of subsystems that needed to maximize the effect of a capability. So I'm just wondering, sort of a bit further along, if you see progress or change in the Defense Force in that time.
They're gearing up to acquire things that have been around for decades, while also not taking advantage of what you might call a generational leap that is now clearly emerging. For example, Australia is making a lot of noise and a lot of claims about acquiring the HIMARS missile launcher, and we're getting a regiment worth of them. We see them in use in Ukraine. We see them in use in Israel. They are absolutely a fantastic weapon. But what they're not saying is that the range of the HIMARS, the best case range, it's 500 Ks. So it's 500 kilometers or 300 miles. That sounds like an impressive number. And in the battlefield of Ukraine, it is. And in the Middle East, in the Israeli situation, that is more than enough. But 500 miles in Australia is nothing. So, we'll be able to reach out the far side of Timor in the Arafura Sea. That's about as far as we can go if we're shooting from Darwin. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that the presumed enemy, and I'm not saying they're going to be the enemy, the government is operating under the assumption that China is the enemy or the adversary, the future adversary. And of course, the Chinese have on their warships, on their destroyers, missiles with ranges of 1,500 kilometers. Plus, they have ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which they can fire from the island of Hainan or the mainland of China, which can also reach targets in Australia. So we have a deterrence threat that reaches 500 miles, and that means we can't strike them if they're firing back with things that can reach us from the Chinese mainland or from a flotilla of warships 1,000 miles off our shore. So it's a very useful weapon, but it has to be seen in the perspective of the potential adversary. Now, the only exception, of course, is these nuclear-powered submarines, which will theoretically be able to penetrate into the South China Sea. And with the 12 or 24 missiles, depending on which version we get, they'll be able to strike Chinese targets on the Chinese mainland or targets that are operating at some distance from us. But we're getting them in such a small number, and we can't get a large number of them. And they carry 12 missiles. And as soon as they fire, everybody knows where they are. So the life expectancy of the submarine is probably fairly finite, and it's impossible to replace. So the plan that we're putting together just doesn't intellectually work. And it only makes sense if you look at it in a particular context. But the whole plan that the DSR outlines and then the integrated investment plan puts together creates a defense force that is very similar to the old defense force in that it can only fight as a junior partner in a coalition, presumably led by the United States. And that's what we're actually building. We're building stuff that we can fit into the American system, and we're obtaining stuff such as these used Virginia-class submarines, which may or may not arrive in the 2030s, which can fight alongside American warships. So that's still the way you have to think about the Australian Defence Force. It's designed to be a subset of the U.S. military. And Australians have to ask themselves, is that good enough? Because it's the Australian Defence Force. It's not the U.S. subset Defence Force.
Well, that kind of leads me to another question around U.S. capability. And there was a recent article in Foreign Affairs from Mark Milley and Eric Schmidt. Milley is the former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Eric Schmidt from Google, formerly. In an article that was titled "America Isn't Ready for the Wars of the Future." I don't know if you've seen it.
I've actually read the article.
And one of the things they said is no state is fully prepared for future wars, but some countries are further along than others. And they're really looking at the sort of full scope of what the war space looks like, which is something I wanted to get an idea from you, and I think you partly just answered in the subset sort of description that you've given, but the sort of bigger picture around Australia's capability and how it is prepared to deal with the changing character of war, and what that character looks like in your estimation.
Yeah, that's a very broad question, because it then depends on the context. You have to frame that question. This is something that and this is a political question, and it's something that the Australian political community does very badly. Because when you decide to go to war, and that's whether you're the aggressor or whether you're the victim, you still have to answer the same question. What am I hoping to achieve? I'm about to go to war, which is a terrible thing to do. And you really don't want to do one unless it's really important. And the Australian government doesn't pause to ask that question, is what are we trying to achieve? What's our goal? And the other question they don't ask is, what does peace look like? Because the end point of any war is peace. And you're fighting to bring about peace. So if you don't think about what's the peace that I'm trying to craft, you're just going to lose, because you don't know what you're doing. If you don't know what you want, you're just going to keep fighting, and eventually you'll realize that you're losing. And that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. It's exactly what happened in Iraq. It looks like it's what exactly is going to happen in the Red Sea, because there's no understanding of, what does this look like when it's over? Because war can consist of, and Australia can wage it this way too, irregulars fighting a very low-level conflict, all the way up to high-end total war involving every aspect of the nation state. About the only aspect of war that Australia can't get involved in directly is nuclear war because, we don't have nuclear weapons. But the United States and China have nuclear weapons, and so we may get to experience that particular joy too. Australia probably can't wage any war on its own. Even the intervention in East Timor was highly problematic if it resulted in war. It was a success, but only because nobody did any shooting. Well, the shooting was fairly minimal. The only way Australia can actually participate in a war is with the U.S. assistance. And so the bigger question here is, what does the U.S. plan on doing? And, the U.S. itself doesn't seem to really understand where the lines are. China is clearly what they call the pacing threat, the threat against which you prepare to fight. But what does peace look like in a war between the United States and China? I suspect it looks like a lot of radioactive places because, that's what could happen. And that doesn't sound like, to me, a kind of war that should be waged.
Well, getting back to the personal or personnel level, one of the things that you pointed out, the Army will need to modify the type of individual favored by recruiters. What did you mean by that?
Since the First World War, Australia has been an infantry-focused force. Infantrymen and infantrywomen, they're very physically fit, they're very smart, and the emphasis is on going forward and seizing ground. But in the future wars, what we're seeing, is that range and precision are increasing. And we've known for a long time that you can put a cruise missile through somebody's window. And, if they can spot you, and we see this in Ukraine, they can fly drones and drop grenades through the hatches of tanks. We're also able to sense a lot of things, either from satellites high up in the sky or lower level sensors across all spectrums of the electromagnetic. You can see so much that you may not be able to process it fast enough. And that combination means that, with the ranges of present day weapons, there's no rear, there's no front. It's all just a combat zone, and no one can feel particularly safe, and either side can strike at great distance. And so we also need people who understand how to strike at a distance, how to operate, UAVs and drones. And they may be some distance from the front lines. They may not be in some muddy hole, which requires a fair degree of endurance to tolerate. They may be in some basement someplace, managing these things. It opens up your defense force to different kinds of people who were not able or were not considered assets, usable soldiers in the past. So these days, you might need somebody with, very nimble thumbs as they are able to control, that controller, and they're not marching anywhere. Or the same thing with the ability to analyze lots and lots of data and pick out the connections in discrete sets and be able to then inform the commander, this is what's happening. So there's skill sets that, can be employed by, people who look like me, although younger. And in fact, you can probably start employing a lot of people as civilians and who are conducting what you'd call military tasks, but they're no longer in uniform. And they're working at a terminal, analyzing data, figuring out, where to strike. They'll still be subject to some degree of, military requirements, like, you got to really come to work, although maybe you'll be able to, work remotely from home and release a Hellfire missile while, watching television. These are the kind of things that become more possible in our heavily interconnected world in which you can sense and strike at great distances. Now, what gets in the way of that happening is the natural tendency of a military organization to want to control, to exert downward pressure on individual initiative. And they have to find that balance. And the military calls that mission command. So as long as you're working towards the known objective, you can pretty much do it. But often that is ignored by the senior commanders or the chain of command and even the politicians who want to reach down and do that. So they have to resist the temptation to reach down and let very junior personnel or even civilians make life and death decisions. And that's a cultural problem. But I could foresee a future where we have a uniformed group of warriors who might like to still call themselves warriors, and then another group of people who are very much involved in pursuing a military operation, but they happen to be public servants.
That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. For more on the future of warfare and its many forms, head to 360info.org. You can sign up for our newsletters at Newswire for journalists and understand our work to fight against misinformation with university experts worldwide. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner, Reese Hooker and Lachlan Gaselli. Music by Jan Skubashevsky at Red Moon Studios. I'm your host, Emma Hoy. See you next time.